It is a great pleasure to be here to continue on a discussion that was started earlier, and as the title of that first discussion was how to think about it, it is appropriate that we conclude the afternoon's discussion with a session titled What to Do About It. It is often the case in classes taught by Bill and Ted that we are instructed in how to think about things, but not much on what to actually do about it. This has always been a great frustration of mine. But it is a great pleasure to have a discussion about taking many of the principles and ideas that were discussed in that first panel and try to take them to ground really in two ways. One is to take a look at it from the concept of place from a policy perspective, what this might actually mean for policy making in California, but also to have a discussion around how we think and discuss place in common terms in our rhetoric, in our newsmaking. So it's a great pleasure to be joined on this stage. You have their full bios in your programs, but to the far left, Jim Keene is the...
That's a tribute to my days in Berkeley.
Jim Keene is the current city manager for the city of Palo Alto, but has been in municipal government for over 30 years, working as city manager for cities with a great sense of place, not only Palo Alto, but Berkeley and Tucson. Has also worked at the county level and really is one of the leading thinkers and speakers in the local government world. And I have to tell you, for those who have not been exposed to the local government world, it is a world. And Jim is certainly one of the more unique thinkers and writers. And just as a way of demonstrating that, he is the only local government official whose bio in which he quotes Plato, to give you a sense of the way he thinks about it. And in particular, I just wanted to quote this one line from the bio here, and I quote, "He believes that the future of the world depends upon how we live in cities. Plato said, self-servingly perhaps, quote, there is no place in the city for a philosopher except at its helm." So it is a great pleasure to have Jim here. Joe Mathews to my left is really an accomplished writer and thinker on the subject of place, and is one of the few journalists that I've had a chance to know that really infuses his writing with a sense of how place and history directly affects the stories that he writes on. Joe is the Connecting California columnist and California editor for Zocalo Public Square, which is an ideas exchange that is a project of the New America Foundation and Arizona State University. Before joining New America, Joe was a reporter for 8 years with the LA Times and definitely brings a journalist sensibility to the subject of place and how we think and read about it. Eisenhower said that plans are nothing, but planning is everything. So my plan here for this next part of the discussion is to frame the discussion about what we do about place in three sections. One is to have a discussion about how these concepts of place directly influence the work that you do, first as a journalist and writer, and also as a public leader. The second is to take a look at the intersection between an understanding of place and how it influences either positively or negatively civic engagement. And then finally have a brief discussion about how the sense of place should be influencing the work we do. What are the qualities for either public leaders or journalists that we should be inculcating, whether it be in policy schools or schools of journalism, so that in the future, public leaders and those who write about our public square have a deeper sense of place and can communicate it. So I'm going to introduce each one of those three sections with a story. And so the first story, you might know that the Davenport Institute, the work we do here is Our mission is to support and promote greater public engagement in policy making. And as part of that, we have 3 programs. One is we're a grant maker. We give grants to municipalities to support this work. I consult on some of that work, and we have a network of consultants that we bring in to facilitate public discussions. And finally, I train people in how to lead more effective and inclusive public processes. And this discussion of place, I think, most resonates with me because of one of the first projects we worked on at the Davenport Institute was really one of the largest. It was a project that we had given a grant to, but I was also asked to consult on. It was with a water district up in Northern California, the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District. And if any of you think that the Bay Area is Northern California, I am here to tell you it's not even close. Because if you haven't been to Humboldt, then you don't know that you land at San Francisco Airport and you drive 5.5 hours north, and you're still in California, by the way, and you're in Eureka. Now, the problem that Eureka had, and the one that we had given a grant to help facilitate and attempt to solve through greater public engagement, was an issue rather unique to California, in that the water district had too much water and didn't know what to do with it. And 5 years before the grant project that we became more directly involved in, the water district had made a decision, understanding that they had all this excess water, to sell that water to Southern California. Now, what happened after that story hit the front page of the newspaper can only be described as my father is wont to say, that it was on for young and old. There were lawsuits flying back and forth between community members and the water district. There was a recall of a board member. There was a real fracturing of a community that didn't feel that they were really involved in making this very vital public decision. And it took 5 years for the community to begin to heal in such a way with a new general manager and new board members that they were going to reapproach the public to help make this decision again. So we had given a grant, we brought in an outside facilitator. It became a 13-month process in involving the public in making this decision. And in one of the first public meetings, I was up there to observe. It was held at the Elks Lodge in Eureka. And I was there to be merely an observer. This was a facilitated discussion. There were about 150 people there, all around round tables, and we were looking at different aspects of where the water could be sent to or kept more locally in the district. And within 30 minutes of the table discussion that I happened to be supposedly a silent observer to, I could not stay silent. Because what was beginning to develop is when the discussion was maybe we should see this water as oil. It's a natural resource we have in the ground. We could really increase the economic development of this area by selling this water outside of the district, maybe to some place outside of Northern California. Now, you should know to the people, and I didn't know this at the time, but the people living in Eureka, Southern California begins at Sacramento. And what I didn't understand in the discussion, because several people made this point of it, was that nobody should be living south of Sacramento, according to the people living in Eureka. This is an environmental disaster. All we're doing, this is complete and total Chinatown. Nobody should be living here. It's really a desert. And anything that we might do as a community with our water is essentially facilitating lifestyles that we don't want to perpetuate. And at one point in the discussion, which I remember as if it were yesterday, one of the local residents who was there to give his informed opinion about what should happen with their water said, "Pete, I know you're from Los Angeles. We could care less if Los Angeles just dried up and blew away." Now, if you graduated from the USC School of Public Policy, you would not be able to answer or understand that response. Because if you looked at it on an Excel spreadsheet, the real smart decision would be to sell the water outside the district. But in the place that is Northern California, this policy decision was not going to, dare I say, hold water. So I hope this introduces a question or a set of questions here about the importance of having this understanding of place as it relates to policy making. And we'll go to you first, Jim, because one of the things I think, unfortunately, that happens in policy schools is we tend to recommend policy making based on a set of facts without a set of people that are meant to then, that are essentially going to be incorporated into the policy decisions that are made. And so at a conference here at Pepperdine just a couple of years ago, we had the Director of City Planning for the City of Los Angeles, Gail Goldberg. She's now no longer there, but she said something at that conference which was about public engagement and planning. She said, we always put people up in front of the public who are the least prepared to be there. And what she meant by that is not that their planners didn't understand building heights or setbacks or all the technicalities of planning, but when their plans met a public that was then going to be the victims of those plans or the recipients of those plans, planners were unable to really adapt their plans to local knowledge and local conditions. So Jim, I want to begin with you. You've been a public leader in, as I said before, at least 3 places with a unique sense of themselves. I mean, between Berkeley, Palo Alto, Tucson, you've worked on the East Coast as well in the DC area. Could you tell us a little bit, when you started working for in those places, how important was it for you to really get a sense of the history and background and kind of the mores of that community and what might be possible from a policy-making standpoint?
Sure. Well, first of all, that Humboldt thing just sounds like another day at the office to me. And I think that's the terrain of any community. So, first of all, I'm pretty fortunate in that, you know, I've made a conscious decision to sort of pursue this path. So I've gone into this with my eyes wide open, and I've also chosen to work in places that I think have a strong sense of place. They've had very different identities, but they've also been places that I wanted to be, even though they were quite different. I was Deputy County Manager for Development in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is Dulles Airport and west out to Middleburg in the Virginia Hun Country. I left there from DC and I moved to Flagstaff, Arizona, where I was County Manager of the county that includes the Grand Canyon and Navajo and Hopi Reservation. I mean, the first day I'm walking down the street in Flagstaff, I have a tie on and everything, and literally 2 drunk Navajo guys in the middle of the day walk by and they go, "Nice tie." I'm thinking, oh, well, I gotta change real fast here. And obviously Berkeley, you know, I've got a lot of Karl Marx and Hegel quotes I can pepper the discussion with here. And obviously, you know, I've chosen this work because I want to be able to be effective. And in order to be effective, you have to be relevant to the place in which you are. And so I've taken very much the view that, and also that I'm motivated. I have 2 big purposes for the work that I'm doing, which are not typically expressed by chief executives of a city. One is what I shared with Pete earlier today, sort of a line from Daniel Kemmis about, you know, I'm interested in the politics of rehabilitation of places. And also I'm trying to see whether or not the American experiment self-government can really work. So believing in those 2 things, obviously I don't have a colonizer's mentality when I have gone to a place, but rather to seek myself in the place and learn the vernacular of the people, not to be manipulative, but to authentically kind of connect with the place. And we recognize that the solutions have to be indigenous. So when I was in Flagstaff, ultimately, I remember once we were going through this exercise on a mission statement, and all the typical stuff, and it was all just the same kind of thing that every city or whatever county has. And I said, oh my God, this is so dead. The whole point of a mission or values perspectives are a framework in which to sort of qualify your decisions against, to say, hey, are we in line with what this was? So I wrote a little preamble to it, not that it was so artful, but I wanted to say this is the linkage that I see everywhere. And so the preamble just said, we live in a land of vast and endless beauty, home to many cultures. That's all it had to say that suddenly enlivened it, in that everybody will kind of go, well, okay, I get that. I don't get all this. We want to have a fishing about all the usual sorts of things. Same thing in Palo Alto, for example. Here's how I describe what our city is about. We're a startup city. We're small but mighty. Our job is to try to pilot initiatives at a small scale with the goal of ultimately trying to scale them up and upload them to the wider world. We can do things here that in the town that I'm in that many other places can't do. But if we can show that it could be done, then there's a possibility of having a bigger impact. So we try to make our organization as entrepreneurial as possible, actually, in order to be relevant in the community, in order to build enough trust that people are going to actually partner with us much more. And that was very different than when I was in Tucson, as I was joking earlier. I had all sorts of Latino and cowboy metaphors when I was in Tucson. But it wasn't just the language. It was this recognition that the solutions to a place come from the people who live in that place. And if they don't come from them, they're not going to stick. And it's completely impossible to be effective, particularly when you're an outsider, if you don't do everything you can to sort of not only become an insider, but in many ways be able to reflect back the history of a place. And a lot of times an immigrant can do that. There's a little variation on the T.S. Eliot thing in a way. I'm not going back to the same place, but I'm coming to it for the first time. And in many ways you're able to see the great kind of gifts and qualities in a place. And if you're able to sort of honor those and mirror those back to folks, you can actually be much more effective. So the goal has all been, it's not to say that you don't want to bring ideas in from the outside, but I think that is another line that I have in my bio from Aristotle. It says the city is a partnership for living well. Yeah. And that partnership has to be fully, you can't fake it, you know what I mean? So I have to be at home in the policy recommendations that we're making and not at the academy or some other place.
Joe, you have a piece in today's Fox and Hounds talking about this incredible story about a state senator who's been indicted by the FBI, just some incredible malfeasance there. And one of the ways that you frame this story is that by saying as California, we finally have a political scandal worthy of our state. Now, and at the end of it, because of the relationship between this particular state senator who represented the Bay Area and some of this happening in Chinatown, you draw the analogy again to Chinatown at the end of the piece. Now, if you were writing in North Dakota, these things would be rather irrelevant. But in so much of your writing, you really try to frame the story, not either in the history of what's happening there locally, or trying to attach it to an identity of California. And so I was wondering just how intentional that is and how important that is to you.
I always feel like it's an uphill battle to try to, I've read a California column, I've written books that are described as being about California, but I think that ties pretty, the California-wide tie is pretty weak. I don't care about the people in Humboldt either. Right back at them, right? I'm from Southern California, fourth generation, and I care about here. I care about places like Humboldt and Northern California. They interest me, but do they matter to me? There's that difference, and California is really, it's a hard thing to do because it's really it's a country that we don't acknowledge. It's got kind of or a loose confederation of a place. It's got regions that really have the quality size of American states. So we're essentially a country without states, and I think part of the problem of coming out of discussion of place in California through discussion of governance or government is that there's a mismatch. The boundaries of our governance and many overlapping boundaries don't match with what our places actually are. There's a profound mismatch. I think we're at a very local level citizens of our particular neighborhood and citizens of a region. I mean, I'm from Greater Los Angeles. I'm really from Pasadena. And I think of myself as Pasadenan, Southern California, really before I think of myself as a Californian. I think that's, from what I can tell, true of most Californians. But California governance is a highly centralized thing where decisions are made in a place that I have to get on a plane to go to. That's a lot of centralized government there. So you have it's both too big and also too small. With all due respect to Jim, our cities don't have a lot of juice or power compared to cities in a lot of other places. They're very small. They tend to divide up the regions. As a reporter, I spent, one of the things when you talk to people is you ask where they're from. In California, it's very hard. People are often wrong when they tell you what city they live in. I remember covering, LA mayor's races where people would tell me, I'm going to vote for Villaraigosa. And then you sort of pressed it. They didn't realize they couldn't vote for Villaraigosa because they lived in Santa Monica. That sort of thing happens a lot. I think at the local level, actually, and with all due respect to Jim, if you wanted to align governments with place, I'd probably get rid of cities, go to regional governance, because the local governance thing that I think does correspond to community, and also the question that I always ask to figure out where people really are from. The killer question, the question you always have to ask is, where did you go to high school? Because if you ask people where you go to high school, that's essentially, that places them where they're from. Now, now that's an imperfect system approach because, we love high school sports. This is the capital of high school sports. It's greatly intense and it's, high school versus high school, communities versus community, but in that tied up place and the support is very strong. The readers for stories in Orange County Register and LA Times about high school sports are very high. But when you go and look at sports teams, high school sports teams in Southern California, particularly elite sports like basketball or football, you'll find, without exception, that at the best high schools, the best athletes and the best teams are not from that community. I think the last number I saw was there were over 13,000 approved transfers last year by the CIF, the high school sports governing agency. And I went a few years ago, followed a team at Compton Dominguez High School where the center was from Hemet, which is well east of here. The point guard was from the Bronx. The shooting guard was from Kentucky, and there were the other two starters were sort of, one was from Long Beach, which was nearby, and one was from actually Compton. And that's sort of the typical picture. And it was interesting in listening to the first panel that tie between the pride in place, but a desire for the best, the pulling the best from everywhere, and a very big California value, big American value, are in conflict, even in something as simple as high school sports, which you would think would be profoundly about community and place in all its regards.
Well, actually, what you said, and here go my plans out the window.
Before you do that, I just want to say one thing about your example, because I'm very familiar with this sort of strong statement, action. Berkeley had a very elaborate foreign policy, for example. No, seriously. And I used to say our perspective in Berkeley was to think locally and act globally. It was much easier. But if Humboldt voted to stop sending marijuana to Southern California, that would be a whole different issue than a little bit of water that they have. So people know still what.
And actually, not to go too far down that rabbit hole, in the discussion of what to do with the water, that actually came up with several department meetings. We have a great local agriculture here. Joe, you brought brought up something, I wasn't gonna go here, but I think it's interesting, that this disconnect between the sense of place and governance. So, I wanted to read a quote, you're obviously gonna hate this, but this is from a piece that you wrote last April. It was, the title of it was, Do We Need 150 More Years of Getting California Wrong? And towards the end of it, you wrote this, quote, therefore, as a starting point for a less volatile conversation about our state, let me suggest one small way to clear up people's thinking. Stop talking about the state government of California as though it were the same thing as the state of California. I myself have been guilty of this, but it's a mistake. State governance here is undeniably dysfunctional, but California itself is one of the world's most innovative and prosperous places. How much is governmental weakness undermining the state's many strengths? That's the real question of California. And so, I think you wrote that.
Yes, I did.
Yes. And so, I want to tie that statement, and it also connects with what you were saying, Jim, about Palo Alto, is that you understood when you landed there that there needed to be an understanding of entrepreneurial policymaking that fit the entrepreneurial nature of the community in a way that many other cities don't have to deal with. I remember you introduced me to Jonathan Reichenthal, who's your chief information officer. Very interesting cat. Just really sees the connection between technology and citizens and government just in some very interesting ways. And one of the things he told me in looking at these issues around government technology was that, Pete, we're being pushed in this direction by a citizenry that gets this far better than many of us do here at City Hall. And so maybe to start, just to come back to you here, Joe, this possible disconnection between how we're doing government and the view of California as a government and the view of California as a place.
Wow. I mean, I think the view of it as a place is much more positive than the view of it as a government. But again, it's very volatile. We're, one year we're the source of all dysfunction, and just read The Economist. It changes every 6 months. Like once we're showing how the decline of Western democracy and the entitlement state, and the next we're the soul of innovation and 21st century thinking. I mean, it doesn't. I don't think it. I mean, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I do feel that, though, that project you mentioned, entrepreneurial culture. I mean, I think you can do that, but I actually think California, in a weird way, we've sort of taken away power from local governments and local officials. I mean, we really set up people like Jim DeFeo. It's remarkable how good our cities are, given how many constraints there are on it. And I think if we let those cities sort of, I mean, the main thing is we don't let local officials basically raise taxes. I mean, in any sort of recognizable way, you have to either go to the legislature, you have to go to the people and get a supermajority of some kind.
Right.
So, I mean, that, Tim O'Neill said all politics is local, and that was true in Massachusetts. But it's not. When you take out that power to tax, it does a lot of really weird, distorting things that aren't just about limiting services. They also create weird incentives for people to spend. I mean, the most excessive spending in California has been in local governments because there's so many of them. You can't pay attention to all of them. And they also have a great incentive to spend because they don't have to set the tax rates for the money they spend. So, in that kind of system, you want to spend as much as possible. It's actually almost sort of rational.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I mean, it's to your original question of the place versus the government. I mean, I do see those things sort of in competition, and I hope we will rationalize our government. But part of our problem is because we're so inventive and creative as a people and place. What we actually need, that's hard for us to see, is a very simple, vanilla government. Where local communities have power and it's structured more normally. Instead, we keep adding greater complexity and wrinkles to this thing that's really hard for anyone to sort of understand or manage or predict. I mean, I find what's scariest about California is when I talk to the smartest and most experienced people in California. I think I've met almost all of them now, and none of them understand how our governance system works, really. You know, they don't really understand it. No one understands the machine.
Can I jump in on
Yeah.
that? So I agree with Joe as in the fact that the governance structure that we have doesn't match which are increasingly systems problems we have that exist on a larger geographic scale. I mean, so a perfect example is while we have some coastline in Palo Alto on the bay, we're not going to do a darn thing about sea level rise by ourselves. It isn't going to do us any good to build a 4-mile seawall in Palo Alto. So, and almost all of the issues of our time, whether it's housing, transportation, environment, income, jobs, housing, location, income inequality, all of those things, you know, they exist on a broader basis and scale for the most part than any of our kind of existing governance structures, which are not just at the local level. I mean, there's this plethora of regional organizations that have some piece of some hold on some part of the elephant. And then we have this vertical layer cake of, you know, federalism between the state and the national government, all of whom have roles. And I definitely agree with Joe. And having worked in 4 different states in the United States, we certainly, in my view, have the most administrative state government that has really colonized in many ways local governments. Even the recent move of realignment is just dishing off a problem that the state really couldn't solve on its own. And so we've got 482 cities or something in the state of California, 109 I think or so are charter cities like ours, which have more autonomy. But even very simply, I mean, our inability to do something like, say, change the sales tax formula, if we wanted to charge sales taxes locally on services, if we were able to get our folks locally to say that we're willing to tax services here in order to provide, why is that a problem? Why would we be restricted? And we can't just blame the state, because so many of those statewide rules have actually, we of the voters have voted them in through initiative. So it's not just the state legislature that's done that. Now here's the problem, and Joint Venture Silicon Valley just issued a report on regionalism that basically said top-down consolidation won't happen and can't happen, it has to be grassroots, because people do want to keep the local flavor. I mean, probably if you went to any city, hardly anyone would say, yes, let's disappear into the adjoining city and merge and that sort of thing. Because there does develop a kind of a neighborhood feel from one city to the next. Mm-hmm. And the other one is on the governance, on the engagement, self-government side. Actually, what we're wrestling with, regardless whether you're even Palo Alto, which is the smallest city I've ever managed, or you're a Los Angeles, we're wrestling with ways to be able to get even more local in decision-making and self-government within those places. So that's a counterpoint to consolidation, in the same sense that people are going to say, well, I want my local representatives at least, or not only that, I want to be actively involved. And as scale gets bigger, sometimes that gets to be more and more challenges. That's why you see neighborhood councils or things like that popping up. So, I mean, this is a tension. I completely agree. It's a real problem. It results in a lot of waste and ineffective decision making. And yet, in the end, I would also say, if we're talking about place, in many ways, it allows the opportunity for people to cluster in places where they feel, in some ways, there's potentially a special affinity for them. So I don't have an answer to it.
I was thinking, just as you were saying that, some of you may know that there's a Silicon Valley investor named Tim Draper who has a proposed ballot initiative that apparently is very close to having the requisite number of signatures to qualify, that will be on the November ballot, that proposes to divide California up into six different states. And I didn't think about it quite in these terms, but that to me, that is a question of place, really, in many ways. And to hear some of Tim's arguments about, I mean, I've heard him make the argument, hold on, Joe, make the argument that as he goes around the state, that these different regions really don't feel tied to a state. They feel very distant from the state, and maybe for some of the same reasons that you all are talking about, the power of the administrative state based in Sacramento, the centralization has taken away those, the ability for local communities to take a more forward role in policy making. But I want to move on to this second point about the connection between place and civic engagement. And to do that, to begin with a story. Almost exactly 3 years ago, I got a phone call at my office just over here at Pepperdine from a friend of mine by the name of Ken Hampion. He is the longtime city manager for the city of San Luis Obispo, and he had just retired and was on his way to his first interim city manager gig, and he wanted to let me know about it. And so he calls me up and says, "Pete, I've got good news and bad news for you." I said, "Well, what's the good news?" He goes, "Well, I'm just coming out of retirement here. I just got a call from a city in the Los Angeles area. They've had some issues around transparency and public engagement, and I was really hoping you could consult with me on trying to improve the civic participation here in the city." And I said, "Well, that sounds great, Ken. What's the bad news?" He said, "I'm driving to Bell." Now, some of you know the story of Bell. But I don't know if you know the story of the last 2 years there, or even the last 3 years there. What I got introduced to in a consulting process over a series of about 6 months, and I still know a couple of council members there, was a city that was, or citizens of Bell, who are Bellians, by the way, and a little bit of history, by the way. Bell, California was also developed by the same family that developed Bel Air. They're very different, by the way. And one of the things I learned from getting to know the residents and the new leadership that had come on, the new council members and the new people that were leading that city, was that there was a real sense of embarrassment. These were people that knew how bad their city had been seen. Because it wasn't just about the malfeasance of certain people working in City Hall, there was a level of disengagement there, right? Because as some of you may know, the path towards the corruption in Bell actually began at a very highly underutilized ballot box. Because Bell had made the decision in 2005 to go to charter city status, which disconnected Bell from state regulations in many areas of public sector pay. And in a city of 35,000 people, less than 400 people turned out to vote. Now, as I came on the scene and got to meet people there, what was just palpable was this sense of defending Bell. That these were people that understood how that the name of Bell had become an embarrassment, but these were people who had gone to Bell High School, they had lived there for decades, and they were now participating out of a sense of defensiveness. There had been a very popular op-ed written in the LA Times by someone I respect a lot, named Rick Cole, who's now a deputy mayor in Los Angeles, proposing that Bell be consolidated to 4 or 5 other South Los Angeles cities into a larger municipality of South Los Angeles. And that had just hit the Sunday Times a week prior to my showing up there. And when I had a chance to meet with some of the residents, believe me, even though on the face of it, or if you looked at the map, you wouldn't believe there's much of a difference between Bell and Maywood and Cudahy. If you speak to the people in Bell, there is a huge difference. And so what was now prompting this renewed sense of civic engagement was really a defense of this place called Bell, one of the 10 smallest cities in America by geography. One that was definitely, if you looked at the map, just seemed it was just kind of smushed and covered on all sides by this mammoth city of Los Angeles, but really understood itself to be different and something worth defending. And so, to start with you, Jim, I make the argument in my chapter, and also in Ted's chapter as well, that if there is to be greater public engagement, there needs to be a greater sense of place, that there is something in the policies that are created, something worth defending and customizing for the people of that particular area. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, I think the premise is right. I mean, I think that place is important to civic participation, and I think it's important to self-government. Now, that said, I would say from my perspective, we have really little effective self-government that takes place in our country, really, and that's not that I'm not advocating direct democracy, but I mean really informed, involved government, and I'll give you some of the reasons that I think you all would know why that happens. But you know, I think we can still create and nurture great places that fit the people who live there, and they can have a strong sense of belonging without being active citizens still in that place, in the sense of participating in the civic, in the governmental decisions of their community. I did this interview with a governing magazine last year when they'd asked me sort of what I thought the role of government was, and I thought, God, man, I've been doing this for 30-some years, and I was scurrying trying to really think about what it was, and you know, I don't think of it all at the local level, which is what most people would say is, oh, we're service providers, or we're in the delivering services to folks. I don't think that's the role of government. And I said, well, I think the prime role of government is to help facilitate the conversations and the agreements that people will make about how they're going to live together. I mean, at its core, that's what sort of came to me. And so if you're thinking about that being the role, we're not necessarily doing a great job of that. And I think it invokes some of these challenges of, to the extent people see themselves in a particular place or local and how bound they are to it versus cosmopolitan. I think it's that we have very little processes that really effectively work for participation. I mean, most of them, for example, are just individual voices or a special interest group that has to organize to speak up to the government. Whereas you would imagine that real self-government would have citizens really talking to each other about how to solve things. That has to involve the government. But the truth is, at the local level, I'd say most cities are actually would actually love, despite the fact that citizens may not see it this way, would actually love to have much more of that really engaged problem solving taking place and be able to sort of kind of come in and say, let's take that up and implement it. The second thing, though, is that people are busy. I mean, they're really they have busy lives, and as Jane Jacobs famously said, cities are problems in organized complexity, and the issues and the things you have to work through are very, very complex. And some of the best examples of engagement we can see is around a crisis issue where people can kind of come together and get together and solve it, or you know, whether it's doing something good and positive or overthrowing a government, right? Literally, we saw that in Arab Spring. We just saw this recently in the Ukraine. But the aftermath of that's a whole other deal. It's a whole other deal, and more often than not, particularly places that don't have the right institutions and foundations, you pretty much, I mean, there's a real risk of descending into autocracy or a totalitarian kind of situation right in the aftermath of the revolt and that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of work to do in this area. I mean, I have some ideas. And then the other thing is people are different. I mean, there's different strokes for different folks. People live on different time cycles, you know, I mean, and I'm sorry, I'm not a big online democracy kind of person, but I do think that it can serve as the digital world can serve as an introduction to the analog world in some ways if done right. And there will be people who can engage at 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm sorry, and they're never going to go to a city council meeting when they're feeding their kids or that sort of thing. So busy people, different strokes for different folks. So we've got to design different processes, and we're actually in the process of thinking this through. I may have a chance to talk to you more about this citywide initiative we call our Palo Alto. And it's a very interesting, massive kind of community participation exercise we're undergoing just right now. But we've got to find 50 different ways for people to be able to participate, to match up. And anyway, I'll talk more about ideas if we get a chance.
Good, and we will. Yes.
I mean, I think, you know, if I were a city manager running a city, and it's a good thing I'm not, but I would cultivate a sense of fear and being under attack for any sort of engagement. I mean that's what drew Bell together.
Yeah.
I live in South Pasadena, a very small city in Southern California, and it's a I mean, I grew up in Pasadena. I live about a mile from the house I grew up in, but I live in South Pasadena because it was literally it was both close and it was about the best public school district in Southern California. I have 3 little boys that I could buy into, and barely at that. But South Pasadena is completely bound together as a very cohesive place because they've had an enemy since 1965, and that is the 710 freeway, which was supposed to be finished then, and they've been fighting it for 49 years. And it is, you know, it is hilarious to receive mail at election time in South Pasadena because, you know, you get the first, there is no other issue. The first mailer is, I am against the 710 freeway. The next one from the candidate is, no, I am really, really against the 710 freeway. The third one is, I do not use the number 7 in any combination. I mean, literally sellable. And these are just, and this is the school board candidates. I mean, you should see the city council people. You know, everyone has a hat or a shirt that says 710 through it. And it brings a real unity, defines the community. I mean, I think the good schools also define the community. And you know, there are a lot of us tiger moms there, but you know, that's, I mean, I think there's something about and I've said this I think before here, but you know, the fear is a greatly underrated tool, underused in fact, and should be used more to drive engagement. I think the other one, there's sort of 2 F's to that, and there's fun. I mean, we should, you know, I would challenge people who work in cities and things is, you know, does the space where you ask people to come, is it fun? Does it reflect your community? Is there something, when you go to the Palo Alto City Council chambers, and would you know you were in Palo Alto? You know, I mean, you know, there hasn't been that kind of work done. We're still, again, it's just another way where the government structures don't really reflect the specialness of the place. I think that's, you know,
Well, and they do both, right? I mean, I think one of the things that I've learned firsthand, I've learned it even right here in the city of Malibu, where I've done some consulting work, is not only does it, although I think the new city hall has at least somewhat more of a sense of place, the place where people meet, you don't have a sense of place there, and it doesn't facilitate real public discussion. I tell the story all the time in the training work that we do, that I was asked to facilitate a discussion around a local zoning ordinance issue, and I thought that I had everything set with the mayor and the planning director, that we wanted to have a public process that was going to have people in round tables, and we were going to be discussing different priorities for the zoning ordinance. I show up about a half hour before the meeting. This was only about 1.5 years ago, or 2 years ago. And the mayor meets me at the front door of Malibu City Hall, walks me right into the council chambers, which, as you could probably guess for Malibu, is an acoustically perfect sound stage. But it's an auditorium with chairs welded to the ground, everybody's looking up, and there's a stage about 5 feet off the ground with a dais there. And somehow we're supposed to have some sort of community discussion around this very, very personal issue, essentially. What is this place going to look like from a physical development perspective over the next 10 or 20 years? It was set up so that people were going to be pushed in single file down the 2 aisleways to a microphone and look up to the great powers that be in the planning commission, and somehow we were gonna have some public discussion. And so, both in conveying a sense of place and what is unique here, but also facilitating public conversation, the design of our public spaces, I think, is really something that could be.
Well, I would say just in general, obviously design, physical design in every aspect is a really key issue. One, obviously, is supporting a sense of place. And then in this public realm of decision making, it's key. So I'll give you an example of one of the things we're doing. So we, like, if you go over, actually you should do this sometime, you ought to get a picture of all of the city halls in public buildings in California. I mean, so many of them were built during probably the absolute worst period of history for any public building to have built. I mean, they're either this brutalist kind of architecture, or of course in our case, we had, Edward Durrell Stone was the architect, famous architect, but it was built in absolutely the worst time in a university town, 1970. Opened it was 1970. Well, what was happening in 1970 in University Place? So the place looks like a fortress. I mean, there are slit windows that go all the way up, so you can't break any windows or anything. There's nothing on the first floor of any use at all because you didn't want anybody coming in and taking over the city hall, you know, and occupying it. So it's been this dead space forever. You walk into City Hall. We're changing all this, but literally the first thing you see is this thing. It was. When I got there, it's called revenue collections. I said, oh, that's great. Welcome to City Hall. Only thing we want is your money. You know, this doesn't belong to you in any way. We want your money. So we're changing all that. Of course, we're moving everybody upstairs. We've got lots of kind of glass, different meeting rooms and ways to open all the space up. But here's the thing I'm most interested in. We're actually both a combination art piece, but it's a kind of sort of Palo Alto thing, is on this whole wall, a huge multi kind of digital screen design of many kind of digital screens that can both tap for information but can also have photos and videos and stories from people in Palo Alto there seeing and talking, being able to combine them in general things. We can broadcast what other thing, or we can meet individual city employees, what they do, who they are, what they're interested in. Now, the whole idea is we want and I want a coffee bar in there and that sort of thing when people come in. When you come into City Hall, what used to be this just completely dead space that collected your money, and then of course we have so many permits for parking and stuff, you know, people have to queue up, you know, and they block everything for everything else, to suddenly this space that actually starts at one, tell people a story about the place that they're in with the people who live there. We've already sent out kids doing interviews with people, you know, I mean, young folks doing video interviews with people that could start to be parts of just ongoing things to make it a little. Now, that doesn't change everything, but it is a shift, you know what I mean? And obviously it's a palpable shift. The other thing the other thing I would just suggest is, on top of this, not only think of the way the buildings are, read the signage in public buildings, really start to pay attention, you will be amazed. It is a displacement experience when you really pay attention. If you're so inured to it, you probably don't notice, but if you start reading them, you'll be surprised.
Your thoughts on the design aspects of our public spaces? And
I mean, I'm trying to convince the people in Santa Monica where the office of Zocalo, our nonprofit daily publication ours, is just, I think they're going to do it. It's just, you don't have to hold council in council. Yeah. I mean, that is a rare city where people show up for council, though it's
right.
like an event. But
in cities I've worked in, we do have a lot of people still show up, but
yeah,
it's still a subset of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's not just about design. I mean, it's about yeah, I mean, part of the problem is you don't have a lot of fear because a government can't tax you. You're not going to be afraid of. And that's sort of a governance thing, but also fun. I mean, I know this makes city attorneys go crazy, but I wouldn't hold a public event in which I didn't, serve beer and wine and or ice cream, something that would draw the folks out. I mean, for goodness sakes. I mean, people talking about how I can't get into council meetings. I mean, I would start with that.
Yeah, start with a kegger. Let's go.
I mean, it probably some
might get better decisions.
Things might start to make sense.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we definitely do talk about in the training is that if you're not feeding people in some way, shape, or form at your public events, then you're not doing everything you could to create an inviting space to people. And that's not just to overcome the objection that people in the public might have, which is to say, I've got to serve dinner at home. It's not just overcoming the objection, it's also that when you serve people and you eat together, even if it's for a half hour prior to a public meeting, you have a completely different set of relationships that can develop. And that engenders a completely different conversation that happens afterward. Just to finish out that story that I began with Malibu, after I started twitching at seeing where this public meeting was being held, the mayor said, well, maybe we can do something else. And so what he did was, and this was 20 minutes before the meeting, at which we had about 140 or 150 people show up. He knew that he had space in the senior center, which is still in City Hall, but it's off to the side. But the senior center was actually a glass-walled building, glass-walled room on the first floor. So there's automatically a sense of kind of transparency and the air coming in. And while we didn't have enough room to set up tables, we set up chairs in a semicircle. And then we didn't put the dais where the mayor and the planning director and the city planner were up on a riser. We actually put it at ground level and off to the side. And even those little modifications, which didn't cost any more money than anything else, just kind of thinking about the perspective of the public engendered a much different conversation where people actually, it's not worth getting too deeply into, but I actually heard other people's stories for the first time. And there were several instances where people who had never spoken in the meetings that were the typical 3 minutes at a microphone really spoke for the first time on some of these issues. I want to close with our last question, and then I think we're doing okay on time here for at least 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A from you all. About this question of skills. What are things that I make the argument in my chapter that the public leaders of today and tomorrow should be historians, behavioral economists, and conveners. That they need to be making decisions not purely on a rational basis that titrates out of an Excel spreadsheet and this is the way that it works, Humboldt, right? But you're a historian in the sense that you can bring a sense of awareness of what works here in this city, what is going to work in Malibu that's not going to work in Santa Monica, that's not going to work in Riverside, right? But you also need to be a convener, and this goes to what you were talking before about, Jim, that you're bringing people together. And I wonder if both of you, and I'll start with you, Joe, actually looking at it from a journalist and a writer's perspective, what are either the skills or qualities that we should be teaching in our schools of journalism to try to inculcate this sense of place and bring it into the public sphere?
Well, I mean, probably we shouldn't be teaching journalism by itself. I mean, it's seriously. I mean, that sort of. I mean, I'm a real critic of the, journalism for a lot of good reasons, to improve standards, bring professionalism. We've had post-war a real emphasis on training and as though they were professionals, and I think that's healthy, but it is curdled pretty quickly into a certain notion that the journalist is at a remove, that the journalist is got to be separate. I mean, people, and essentially as a result, newsrooms became a monoculture, and like a forest with, where all the trees are the same, or a neighborhood where all the houses are the same size and people are pretty much the same. When the big event comes, you get wiped out. And that's basically what's happened with the internet technology and the like. It wasn't that the internet was the secret, it was that there weren't many people in newsrooms who knew much about it. I could tell stories. And that, there was this emphasis on people having clean and remove. I mean, really, people talk about it almost as a priesthood. Because we were going to keep bias and politics out. And I would say that has worked as being, 3 big newsrooms, the Baltimore Sun, Wall Street Journal, LA Times in my career. That sort of effort to professionalism, ethics, to keep bias and politics out of newsrooms has worked about as well as the Catholic Church's celibacy rules did in keeping sex out of the priesthood. I mean, it just you know, in fact, you find some of the worst people because of the prohibition, I would argue, but that's a deeper conversation. What you need are, you know, are truly diverse sets of people, you know, from all different bits of knowledge in different places, that know different places, that know different expertises, and you try to sort of form them together. And you need people who are going to engage, are not, you know, keep themselves in the room to clean, but are going to jump in, be honest when they're broadcasting or publishing their views about where they come from, but are sort of deeply grounded and engaged. You know, exactly what we didn't have. I mean, the LA Times, when I worked there, had so few people from Los Angeles or knew anything about Los Angeles that one of my jobs was actually to give people a tour. When they, you know, prospective job applicants and new hires. And, I mean, I gave dozens and dozens of tours of Los Angeles, and people would, you know, and I was getting people with very little knowledge who were then going to explain this to other people.
Right.
That can't work. I think a sort of, you know, grounding was almost looked at as a suspicious thing. I felt various times in the report of being under suspicion because I actually knew this place. I'm from you know, two big families on either side, both California families, and people who, you know, contraception seems to have been a problem for. So they're really big families in all corners of the state, except for basically the city of San Francisco. I have no relatives in the city of San Francisco, but you know, I was always under suspicion because I knew too many people too intimately. And you would think that would be an advantage, at least I thought it was.
Yeah.
But it also made people suspicious. I think that grounding, the ability to not just convene, which, you know, papers, we're both a publication and a free event organization, so we do literally convene.
Right.
But, you know, someone who's really grounded and messy and honest, you want someone who's honest, but you don't want someone who's, you know, at our move, I'm a journalist, and that's a really, I actually thought we would move more away from that as the economic model collapsed and as all these people, thousands of journalists lost jobs, but no, it's more clubby and more exclusive than ever. People tie themselves much more closely to it. You know, and I mean, it's really poisonous. I worked at the LA Times for 8 years, and I hate going there now because it's just so poisonous. It's like you go in there, it's like the end of The Departed when everyone starts shooting everybody else. I mean, it's that ugly. And so, you know, I think we need to make a big departure. That we can't just blame the internet or what happened to advertising. It really was in ourselves. It was a cultural change that needs to happen.
Well, it's a big question. So, if our public policy schools and others are really designed to actually implement policy, which I think does take place in place, implementation takes place in place, not in space. It's a whole other, there's a whole repertoire of skills that are not being taught or expected to be mastered to be able to be successful. And probably more of those are on the right side of the brain kind of work than on the left side. And I think that there even needs to be some rethinking about the model. So some of the writings that we're talking about, the centralization versus localism, or the administrative state, and those sort of things, those are imprinted still very much, I think, in people who go into policy work, and they might be specialists or experts in particular areas. I think more people have to be generalists, even if they have a specialty. And I think people need to go into this work who aren't afraid of the public. I mean, I think you have to want to engage yourself and to know how to do that skillfully. So convening isn't just a simple thing like convening. I mean, there are all these qualities. We started to talk about some of them. And you have to have, it's like a dinner party, man. I mean, for your in-laws, before the wedding. I mean, you have to put a lot of care and attention to it. And there has to be expertise in how you set these things up. Daniel Pink did a lot of good work on this, I thought, in his whole new mind. Design. People need to be designers. People need to learn storytelling. You have to be able to tell stories. I mean, I've never seen a meeting yet where the staff hasn't been up there with their powerless things. And they're going on, and it's all there, and then some little old lady gets up at the mic and tells some story about her miserable situation, and the game's over. And the staff is there, wait, I have one more PowerPoint slide to trump her, and you go, forget about it. So I think also people within government have to be able to tell the stories of a place. Third is much more synthesizing abilities than analytical abilities. You have to be able to put things together. You have to see the patterns because these are complicated systems. And so I'm sorry, people have to be skilled to be able to articulate that as to what is happening. And then people have to be way better communicators. I mean, one, not being afraid about it, but also how to do it. And then two other things, I think, much more focus on empathy. And I mean that really. If you read signs, there's hardly an empathetic sign on a public building anywhere. I mean, it's pretty much we put skull and crossbones and Octone on stuff for the most part. So it hardly invites participation. And you mentioned play. There needs to be playfulness. And that's actually one thing we pay a lot of attention to, believe it or not. We're very invested in civic and community events that are repetitive, that build a sense of kind of tradition, and everybody starts to know it. And just in the past 2 years, we started doing these community hackathons, which was, of course, being a tech city, our idea of inviting people rather than writing code to bring down the government to actually try to solve civic problems. The very first one we had over 2,000 people. We closed the street down. We turned it into a block party. We did a movie trailer on the whole thing that was like an invasion of vampires coming to the city, but it was really nerds. They turned the city belongs to the nerds. And then we ended up having, the second one we did last year, had health stuff, artists, street fairs, but we were actually very practical. We were turning over lots of data that we have in the city to code writers and just saying, here's everything that we have. We've developed 5 or 6 at least online solutions and mobile app solutions that let people, you can find any building permit or any issue that's going on anywhere in the city and check the whole history of the thing online now with your mobile app. Was developed by some folks who kind of came out of that, 4 or 5 different things. So we crowdsource a bunch of solutions. But more than that, people start to feel like, oh, I have a stake in the city. Last thing, again, this is Palo Alto because this is what we need to do. We did this mobile apps challenge. We invited actually some very big people from the tech community to sort of say we're awarding a prize to the best actually apps that build civic connectedness. And 30% of the applications we got were from kids under 18 years old. So how often do you have young people really feeling at all they have a stake in government at all? We had 10 finalists. We did a big thing last week. And then in the next month, we'll kind of do the rollout and that sort of thing. But that stuff is also fun. It's kind of lighthearted. It doesn't seem what government is about. And my feeling is we can do that for the next 3 or 4 years in combination with some other things we're doing. We really do build more trust in government, and people aren't going to participate if they don't have a sense of if they don't know and trust the people they're dealing with.
I want to open it up some questions. We have about 10 or 15 minutes here. Yes?
I live in a small town of about 10,000 people, and 100 years ago, if they wanted to put a sewer system in, they all got together, they thought about it, they planned it, they figured out how much it's going to cost, how they're going to tax themselves. Now, they don't tax themselves. They look up the ladder, and the city council doesn't need the people. And they look up and they go, where's the grant, where's from the feds, how can I get this from the state? Because the tax money goes from the people to the state, from the people to the county, from the people to the central government. And so the power of the purse string is out of their hands. The people in Bell didn't have a dang thing to do with their government, and the money kept coming. So to Tocqueville, in the first 50 pages, mentions that what separates the American people who can do with their cities from the Europeans is they have the power within their city, and indeed part of that was the power to tax themselves and to accomplish their jobs. Dysfunctional school districts like the Pasadena Unified School District, they get paid per butt per seat, no matter what the parents say. So I'd like to know if anybody would like to comment on how this dyslexia with the tax system has,
Well, I think
has
we've talked-
disconnected people
Yeah.
from the process of government.
I think we've talked about that in part, the disconnection between governance structure and placemaking, and specifically the disempowerment of municipalities in taxing.
But that, I mean, I think it's true, and just to add, it's a very legalistic culture. We haven't blamed the lawyers enough probably in this discussion today. These rules are abstractions. Politics is, often about abstraction. Actually, to the question of sort of the journalism, the piece of the last question, that, when you're covering politics, I'm a political reporter, former political reporter, reform center, so many reformed, I guess. Those are abstractions, and I think, we have a lot of laws, those are abstractions, at some level. They're not about people or place. I know that a lot of, the sort of the fault, I can't remember which essay was there was quite a bit about sort of rationalism, this high notion that, things kind of be reduced to facts, numbers, rationality. And that's actually, journalism, a lot of where we've been going in conversation, everyone's got to fact check and, data things. I think it's a big mistake. It doesn't also seem to get more people to read you, actually, either. That really, journalism, the best journalism that changes minds and reaches people. One thing they found with fact check studies is that the more you argue people with facts, the more you lose them. You can't win arguments with facts. I mean, anyone has ever, gone to have Thanksgiving with their hick cousins, as I have to do, knows that you can't win arguments with facts, right? I mean, it's a fact of life. So, but the way you win arguments is with affection. And journalism, and these conversations, and politics should be about people and place. Those are, whether you're telling a story, making policy, it's grounded in people and place. You have affection. We actually, Zocalo call it a journalism affection. We want all our stories, whatever their argument, whatever their idea, to be about, to come from a person or be about a place for that reason.
Well, I think we did talk about it. Obviously, that you guys are in charge of this more than we are, in the sense of what we're going to do. But anybody who's talked about a constitutional convention, for example, says, "Oh boy, we better never do that. Things could end up worse, even than we've got right now." I left out one other thing. That an essential skill is to be a humorist in this realm. So along those lines, I've been making this proposal around the state that, if we can't get real reform in the state's role and actually at the national level, we could at least create a lower form of government than us that we could pass the problems on down to them, which is
Questions?
not
Yes.
that I want to do that, but
I wanted to thank you for your comments because Saturday I was sitting at the Linwood Correctional Facility talking to Angela Spotcher on the telephone through the glass. And I work for the Chicago Police Department as a contract trainer, and for years I worked with a woman that was the most impeccable, fine administrator I'd ever worked with in my life. In the city of Ventura, the Los Angeles Transportation Commission. And 2 years ago I'm on the way to Bob Vila's house, one of my former clients, and on the radio I hear this news about Bell, California. I go, isn't that where Angie is, the assistant city manager? Yeah. And as this thing rolled forward, my heart sank. I was astounded because this woman, I've referred her as a consultant to companies. She's impeccable. She was the best person in every department we ever worked with. I said, why? Because in criminal justice, we're really concerned with what I call pathogenic systems. Systems are bigger than people, and I'm here partly because I'm writing about it, and I want to find out what happened in this system. And you're talking about the disengagement and the lack of a sense of place and how valuable it is now. It helps me put some of those things together. But, I have been coming to California to work for years as a consultant. I have a mixed record. I trained the police officers at Park that shot the guy on the platform, so I may be the touch of the devil, and I can blame it all on me, that everything I touch here turns bad, but not, I have had other projects that have gone well.
Well, and I'll just say this, just to go back on the Bell situation, because it is such an incredible story and continues to be. We had Ken Hampion, as I mentioned before, who I call a civic first responder in what he saw there. We had him come speak to students, and if you ever had a chance to really get a deeper sense of what was happening there, what Ken saw in the first 3 or 4 months of his time there is just incredible. And I think one of the things that came out of that, in fact, it was reported in the front page of the LA Times, that the residents of Bell, their nickname for City Hall was the Kremlin. But at the same time they were calling the City Hall the Kremlin, there was always this sense, and you find this as you get a chance to speak with the residents there, that they knew something wasn't right, they just could not put their finger on it. And at the end, I'll never forget this, at the end of one of the budget workshops that I was a part of facilitating, there was somebody at my table named Marco, who had lived in Bell his whole life. And at the end of this 3-hour budget discussion, this public meeting, he said, "Man, Pete, we did some hard work today." And it struck me that that's another part of this, that the place, citizenship is hard work, really, done well, rightly understood. And I think a deeper sense of place almost is a way of helping to facilitate something that's hard, right? It's a way of connecting people to something that they love, to do something that's hard, because it is hard. It demands reading your local newspaper or starting a local newspaper, because Bell really didn't have any media coverage locally. To be that involved, because when that does not happen, bad things happen. And so I think maybe one of the ways of looking at place is a way of facilitating citizenship, because citizenship is hard work. And it only happens out of a sense of love for where you are. And I've seen it so many times around California where people are participating, either they're trying to preserve what they've always loved about where they live, or they want to make it better. Because I think one of the things that comes out, this actually happened up in Salinas, I was facilitating a budget workshop up there, and it started with a whole bunch of discussion around this is where your sales tax money goes, and all the kind of civics 101 about your budget. And at the end of this first workshop, the one thing people wanted out of their budget was to create a city that their kids would come back to after they left high school. And that to me is, again, another way of looking at this sense of place, right? That sometimes is a disconnect from policy, but really should be so foundational to policy and how we have discussions around the policies that we make. Yes, in the back.
I didn't know if there was anybody behind me. My name's Deirdre, and I work here at the School of Public Policy, and I have a question or a request for comment from Joe and Jim. I think it's been touched on in the speaking here. I'm curious about the relationship between fear that you brought up, Joe, and empathy that you brought up, Jim, when it comes to the not in my backyard syndrome that happens in communities that spend a lot of time building up a sense of place that I think perhaps develops over a short period of time. I raised my kids in Palo Alto and saw quite a bit of that there. And I wonder how you work with that so that you're cultivating a good sense, but also an inclusive sense for people who see it, see the value of the community, recognize it, and want to participate. Some of the most heated arguments, and true, I haven't lived there for 4 or 5 years, but most
But
heated,
you know the
angry
Palo Alto
arguments,
process.
yeah, I've ever seen on blogs is in surrounding discussions about neighborhood issues within the north end of Palo Alto and the south end of Palo Alto. I'm just kind of wondering how people who think about these things deal with that not in my backyard, because it's very ugly, and it doesn't, I don't know, I just wanted some comment from experts.
Well, I mean, I think it's sort of the heart of the matter. your question earlier about, or we were gonna talk about sort of provincialism versus localism, I mean, I think that that happens a lot within communities. I think that, well, I think that there are good reasons for why there's a NIMBY perspective. I mean, there are legitimate concerns that people have. And it's very easy for either other folks or even folks within the government who are trying to facilitate something to get frustrated about that. So to understand that. That being said, this is where I think this conversation across the community has to take place when you get into these issues. And actually, Rick Cole had a good line about, I mean, he described it as you've got to get non-zealots involved in some of these conversations in a community, because there is a broad perspective. There is a broad perspective. Here's the problem, I mean, this was my description. We actually have a representative government, but we actually have town hall meetings now, except the problem is a different town shows up every week, depending upon the issue. And they leave and they're satisfied, and then the other folks heard the decision that was made when that town was there, and then they're back in there. So you've got to get these folks talking to each other. And this is the real issue. And it's very, very difficult because people do fear that the place that they have bonded with is changing and it's unknown, and very often they may not like it. There's almost always a whole other community that maybe is not even involved. They're not even here yet because they can't live there, who are saying, wow, this might be great, you know, if I could be here. And a lot of it's generational. Sometimes it's when you got to a place. So I'm not saying this is going to work, but one of the things we are doing in this, our Palo Alto, is we talk about history. So we went back and we found this great interview from 1969 with Fred Terman, who is actually one of the founders of the Stanford Research Park, the engineering school. So one of the godfathers, I guess, of the whole revolution and everything. And they had this really neat interview, and of course it's perfectly dated, 1969, League of Women Voters thing. And finally she says, well, I want to ask you a difficult question, you know, and that's about, what do you think of all of this growth and development, industrialization that's taking place around Palo Alto? This was 45 years ago. And he goes, well, you know, what I figured out is that people who came here, if they came here 25 years ago, that's the place that they like it. If they got here last week, they like it just the way it was when they got here last week. So I think that must be a pretty good thing. So I'm not saying that this works right, but part of our exercise is this beyond City Hall, building community one story at a time, where we want to have people talk about their first year when they came to the place, whenever it was, but not to us, with each other. For people to maybe start to hear, wow, you love the place that I'm feeling bad about, and you love this place that you're starting to feel you're losing. Do we build a base that then will have another conversation? And I envision this having to take us a year to do that, so it's not like we're in problem-solving mode. And then can we start to apply some of that, pull some of those folks out to help us work through some of these issues?
I'm for an honest, heartfelt NIMBYism, but I detect very little of it in my travels in California. I see a sort of highly professionalized, cynical, business-on-business warfare kind of NIMBYism, abetted by the California Environmental Quality Act in many cases, a law that is used, you know, very rarely by true NIMBYs and much more by businesses trying to thwart a competitor, unions seeking leverage in something. I mean, I'm all for honest NIMBYism, and we probably could use a little more of it, but that's kind of my attitude on that question.
I think we have time for two more questions, okay?
I'd like to ask my question on behalf of Ben, too. We make our living with the California Environmental Quality Act. Ben and I have been, this is our third place conference, we've been here 3 years in a row, and Christopher Lash is right. You have to work and have a good job at doing placemaking. There has to be meaningful work. And Pepperdine, there's a whole profession of urban planning. And Pepperdine, the School of Public Policy, is just, I think, awakening to this. And I would like to hear, James, I'm so glad you're here. Because I think what needs, Jim, what needs to happen is the public needs to understand that the planning is something they get their hands on. How much different would it be in Palo Alto if when a citizen came in, you gave them a map of their community plan or their specific plan with markers and that they could annotate and comment on? I just want to, what Jim said that resonated so much with me is we implement policies for spaces and not places. They're abstract, they're things that lawyers won't overturn, or they're things that are technically precise, but they're not adapted to the local particular features of the community. So I just wanted to ask you what your relationship with your planning director is like, and what's worked well in your community to engage the community in that community planning processes. Because yeah, we're all busy, but people put time in what they value, and when they're angry with something, it shows that there's something important to them.
Right.
So just what would be your perspective as a city manager on the community planning process?
Well, it's sort of the heart of things. Of course, if you know, a lot of people in Palo Alto are real mad at us about what's going on right now, but as I try to tell them, you know, this is really a system problem that we have. They're upset about traffic and they're upset about parking, and it's, you know, it's not, we're not self-generating it just within Palo Alto. So, you know, how we're going to deal with that is going to be key. We several years ago, I mean before then, but very actively, we just made a decision to say we really have got to be as open as we possibly can. And we really have one of the leading open government initiatives. It's not perfected, but I mean, as far as all information sort of readily available, I don't want to get another public records request ever, basically. I want everything there and just say, go on the website, man, it's there. You know, don't bother us with this. And we're trying to do that sort of thing. And again, as far as dumping just data that we actually hardly even need to use, but anybody can bore through. But you just have to make things simple and clear to people. I mean, 3 years ago when I was here, we put up notices all around town when there was a project near someone's house, but there was never a picture of it. You couldn't see what it was going to look like and how. We have that on all of the projects now. I mean, both online, but if you go by the house, you can see what your neighbor's planning to do. It's a little invasive. Some people can say, geez, you can really find it if they want to trick out their kitchen with the new Wolf stove and they're going to get all this sort of stuff. Well, I mean, ultimately, they're, you know, the permits are public information and that stuff is being put out. So now that doesn't necessarily make it easier to work through the choices that is there, but it is to seem to be at least a little more of a neutral position is important. That said, we'll have many people on any side of the aisle who are saying we're not being objective, you know, and I'm sorry, because we're not representing the issue the way that they might want to see the issue. Right? And I said at a very contentious community meeting like about 3 weeks ago, and I meant it god awful true, and it was part of the humorous. I said, listen folks, what we're trying to do here is get everybody in the room mad at us, but for different reasons. Okay?
Well, maybe we could, we'll just draw things to a close and just spring off of something you just said, Jim. You know, my wife and I moved to Santa Monica about 8 years ago, and my wife happens to be the 4th generation of her family to live in Santa Monica. And it so happens that for some medical treatment, my in-laws have moved back to Santa Monica from Orange County. And we were out to dinner a couple nights ago. Now my in-laws actually met at Santa Monica High School and taught in the school system and stuff like that. That's just a very long-standing history, but they haven't lived in Santa Monica for 40 years. And so I asked my father-in-law, so what do you think about being back in town and living here? They're just going to be here for 3 or 4 months. And he said, it's so fast here now. You know, I can't get across, you know, town in less than, 15 minutes. And I've been cut off 15 times, driving around town. And it struck me that Santa Monica is, and we can't afford to buy there, but we can afford to barely live there. It is such a beautiful place and a slow place, given a lot of other places where I've lived in my life. But to your point about sometimes places really defined about what first brought you there. And the only way that you can move through a time in which people are living together with different perceptions of that place is when you can convene conversations with those different perspectives. and that out of that, there can be some sort of whole appreciation for why you loved it when you moved here, and I love it now that we.
Can I say one other thing on this? I don't know that this is true, but I was thinking about it last night. I'm curious if when we miss a place from our past, if it's so wholly the place that we're missing, or it was that person we were who was there at that time, and there is some, there's some loss of that person, our own identity in some way, we're thinking about.